Oh, you people always try something? The sentence landed like a slap, casual on the surface, venomous underneath. It slipped from the mouth of Kelly Morton, a flight attendant whose uniform was pressed sharp enough to slice paper. Her tone carried the kind of lazy disdain that isn't careless at all but intentional, designed to wound while pretending to be professional. The words weren't aimed only at the woman in front of her, they were meant for the entire cabin, a broadcast wrapped in a smirk. That woman was Dr. Alicia Grant. She stood poised in the aisle of first class, boarding pass in hand, her black blazer impeccable, her carry-on tucked neatly by her side. Everything about her presence spoke of order, preparation, and belonging. And yet, in Kelly's narrowed eyes, Alicia was an intruder, not a passenger, not a professional, just a black woman who dared to exist in a space someone else thought she didn't deserve. Kelly plucked the boarding pass from Alicia's hand, held it up against the cabin lights as though sunlight could reveal a fraud invisible to her own bias, and shoved it back with a scoff. "You don't look like a doctor," she said, her lips curling. "You look like you belong in coach." The words were blades. Around them, the air shifted. A businessman in 1B raised an eyebrow. A young couple whispered behind raised hands, and then came the unmistakable hum of smartphones being unlocked. Cameras lifted, screens angled. Stories, half written, half true, were already being recorded. Alicia didn't snap back. She didn't fumble or flinch. She simply held her posture, calm and deliberate. Because some storms are not met with thunder. They are met with silence. Silence sharpened into steel. This wasn't just a seat dispute. This was the first shot fired in a battle about power, perception, and the right to exist without apology. And Alicia Grant had already decided she wasn't backing down. The insult didn't hang in the air for long. It spread subtle at first, like ripples after a stone hits water. Row by row, it traveled, weaving itself into whispers, glances, and raised eyebrows. A stranger's smirk became a shared suspicion. A simple act, boarding and sitting in one's rightful seat, was suddenly transformed into a trial by public opinion. Dr. Alicia Grant stood in the eye of it, her boarding pass once again extended toward Kelly Morton. C2A First Class, directly purchased. The facts were simple, indisputable, and right there in black ink. Yet simplicity was irrelevant. Kelly wasn't verifying details, she was verifying identity, weighing worth through the lens of stereotype. Behind Alicia, a businessman leaned toward his neighbor. "Watch," he muttered, low enough to sound private, loud enough for the people around him to hear. "She's about to play the discrimination card." The neighbor chuckled, shaking his head as if the outcome were already written. A few seats back, a college-age passenger typed furiously into her phone, the blue glow of her screen reflecting in her glasses. Tweets were forming before truth had any chance to take root. Alicia remained still, her posture immaculate, her expression unreadable. She wasn't just a passenger now, she was a projection screen, a character in a story others were writing in real time. They had cast her without permission, without dialogue, without context. But Alicia knew something they didn't. Real power doesn't rush to defend itself. It waits. It prepares. It allows the world to underestimate it long enough to reveal just how wrong the world can be. And as the murmur swelled, she slipped her phone from her pocket and typed 3 short messages, one to her executive assistant, one to legal counsel, and one to a number saved only as chairman. With a flick of her finger, the stage widened. This wasn't just a boarding dispute anymore, it was about to become something far larger. The cabin was no longer quiet. The whispers had grown teeth. What began as side comments now carried the sharpness of judgment, slicing through the hum of boarding. "She probably bought a budget ticket and just wandered up here," someone said from row 3, their voice dripping with certainty. A man across the aisle snorted, "Wait for it. She'll start crying discrimination any second now." Each remark wasn't just an opinion. It was a verdict, delivered without evidence, reinforced by nods and smirks. Dr. Alicia Grant didn't respond. Her phone was already back in her pocket, her body angled slightly toward seat 2A, the place she had paid for, earned, and rightfully occupied. She lowered herself into it with deliberate calm, crossing one leg over the other. Her blazer didn't wrinkle. Her eyes didn't dart. She was steady, composed, an anchor in a storm others were fueling. But not everyone in the cabin was eager to pile on. Marcus Hill, a retired firefighter in row 4, had been watching silently, his arms folded across his chest. His brows drew tighter with every cutting remark. Finally, his voice broke the tension, not loud but solid, the kind of voice used to giving commands in emergencies. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said to Kelly Morton, but I saw her boarding pass. It said 2A, first class, no question. Heads turned. Some passengers stiffened, startled by the interruption. Kelly didn't even glance back. "Sir, please remain seated," she snapped. "Security is on the way. We don't need interference." Interference. The word stung more than the insult itself. Truth had spoken, and it was dismissed, downgraded into noise, labeled a disruption. That's what happens when honesty collides with a narrative that was never meant to be questioned. Alicia's hands rested gently on the armrests, fingers still. Her presence was unshaken, but her silence had gained new weight. She wasn't alone anymore. Someone had stepped into the storm, not enough to calm it, but enough to remind the room that she was not invisible. And for the first time, the tension didn't just belong to Alicia. It belonged to everyone watching. The metallic thud of boots against the jet bridge was the kind of sound that changed atmospheres. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, phones tilted higher, their lenses eager to capture what was about to unfold. Authority had arrived. Two uniformed figures stepped through the narrow doorway, shoulders squared, bulletproof vests bulging beneath navy shirts. Radios crackled faintly at their hips. At the front was Officer Thomas Riley, early 40s, clean-shaven, carrying the clipped confidence of someone used to immediate compliance. His partner lingered a step behind, scanning the cabin like it was already a crime scene. "What's the issue?" Riley asked, his voice cutting through the tense silence. Kelly Morton didn't hesitate. She pointed at Dr. Alicia Grant, her face painted with mock exasperation. "She's refusing to move to her assigned seat in coach. I've asked multiple times. She's being non-compliant." The word dropped heavy, non-compliant, a label that shifts the frame, recasting a paying customer into a problem, a subject to be controlled. Passengers leaned forward, hungry for the spectacle. Alicia, seated now in 2A, looked up slowly, her expression composed, unflinching. "Ma'am," Riley said firmly, his gaze assessing her as if she were a suspect, "I'm going to need you to step off the plane so we can sort this out." The air thickened. Cameras zoomed. Someone in row 1 whispered, "Here it comes." Another muttered, "Typical." The cabin was no longer a place of travel. It had become a stage, and every eye was fixed on Alicia. But Alicia Grant didn't blink. She didn't plead. She didn't rise. Instead, she adjusted the cuff of her blazer with quiet precision, then rested her palms flat on the tray table. Calm, deliberate, measured. "Officer," she said evenly, her tone carrying the weight of certainty, "I am in the seat I purchased. 2A, first class." And with those words, the battle lines shifted. Alicia wasn't resisting, she was reclaiming. The storm was far from over, but for the first time, the audience sensed that she wasn't the one on trial. The system was. Officer Riley's stance didn't waver. His hand hovered near his belt, not on a weapon, but close enough to signal authority. "Ma'am," he repeated, firmer now, "please step off the aircraft. We can resolve this outside." The murmurs in the cabin thickened, feeding on the tension. "She's stalling. She's lying. This is going viral." Phones captured every angle, transforming strangers into journalists, turning bias into a broadcast. Dr. Alicia Grant didn't move. She didn't argue. Instead, she reached for her leather handbag tucked neatly by her feet. Her movements were deliberate, unhurried, precise, the opposite of panic. Every eye followed as she slid open the zipper and withdrew a slim wallet. From it, she placed a single card on the tray table. Black, heavy, edged with platinum. The American Express Centurion, so exclusive that most passengers in that cabin had only ever heard rumors of it. A hush fell, thin but noticeable, as the card gleamed under the overhead lights. And then, beside it, Alicia placed another rectangle. Matte black, embossed with silver letters. Alicia Grant, PhD founder and CEO, Nova Aerospace Systems. The silence deepened. Officer Riley's eyes flicked to the card, a trace of hesitation in his otherwise rehearsed demeanor. Around them, passengers leaned closer, trying to zoom their phone cameras, their assumptions beginning to fracture. Kelly Morton forced a laugh. "Anyone can print a card," she muttered, lips curling into a smirk. Alicia tilted her head, her gaze locking on Kelly's. Her voice, quiet but edged with steel, sliced through the cabin. "And anyone can embarrass themselves. Apparently." The smirk vanished. The balance of power, once so lopsided, had shifted an inch. Small, but undeniable. For the first time, Alicia wasn't the one being measured. The airline was. The standoff hung in the air like heavy turbulence, invisible but rattling everyone inside the cabin. Officer Riley shifted his weight, eyes darting between the black card and Alicia's unwavering expression. Kelly Morton stood frozen beside him, her earlier bravado curdling into irritation. Passengers whispered furiously, some whispering doubts, others fumbling to zoom in on Alicia's business card. Then a new sound, a click of hinges, the soft hiss of the cockpit door opening. The noise silenced the cabin faster than a shouted command. Captain Robert Hayes emerged, tall, silver-haired, his uniform crisp, his presence authoritative in a way that required no introduction. 30 years in the skies had taught him how to quiet a room without raising his voice. He looked around, reading the cabin in one sweep. The officer standing stiffly, the attendant pale with tension, the passenger seated calmly in 2A with a card and a boarding pass on the tray. "What's the delay?" His tone was clipped, calm, but edged with expectation. "Passenger in the wrong seat," Kelly blurted before Riley could answer. "She refuses to move, non-compliant." Hayes turned his gaze to Alicia, his expression neutral but watchful. "May I see your boarding pass, ma'am?" Without hesitation, Alicia handed it over along with her government-issued ID. No flourish, no theatrics, just the same quiet precision that had defined her since stepping on board. The captain read the slip once, then again. His brow tightened, not in confusion, but in recognition. His eyes flicked to the business card on the tray. Nova Aerospace Systems. He knew that name. Every airline executive did. Nova wasn't just a company, it was an industry player, one that designed and leased technology woven into the very aircraft he flew. When he looked back at Alicia, something in his demeanor shifted. The authority in the room was no longer tilted against her. It was bending in her direction. Captain Robert Hayes held the boarding pass a second longer, his eyes narrowing slightly. The name printed in crisp black ink. Dr. Alicia Grant. Seat 2A. First class. Paid in full. Nothing ambiguous. Nothing questionable. He glanced back down at the ID, then at the black Centurion card and the CEO business card glinting on the tray table. His lips pressed into a thin line as he reached for the company-issued tablet tucked under his arm. Unlocking the screen, he tapped swiftly into the airline's back-end system. The cabin seemed to lean toward him, every passenger waiting, breath caught. The only sound was the faint hum of the aircraft's ventilation and the occasional buzz of a phone capturing the moment. Then the record appeared. Hayes scrolled, his brow furrowing again, not from doubt, but recognition. There it was. Dr. Alicia Grant. Seat 2A first class, ticket purchased directly through the airline's premier booking line. Amount, nearly $3,000. And, beneath it, a note glowing in pale blue. Corporate partner. Internal use only. Hayes exhaled slowly, his posture shifting. The gravity of the situation settled across his shoulders. He looked up, his eyes sweeping over Officer Riley, Kelly Morton, and then back to Alicia, who hadn't moved, hadn't raised her voice, hadn't done anything but sit with the certainty of truth. "Ma'am," Hayes said carefully, his voice carrying through the cabin. "Everything checks out. You are exactly where you're supposed to be." The words landed like thunder wrapped in silk. Passengers blinked. A few leaned back, uncomfortable with how quickly the narrative had flipped. Officer Riley shifted uneasily, caught between protocol and reality. Kelly's mouth tightened, color draining from her cheeks. Alicia simply offered a small, polite nod. She didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She allowed the weight of validation to rest where it belonged, not on her shoulders, but on theirs. For the first time, the cabin understood. This wasn't a disruption. This was a reckoning in real time. The confirmation should have ended it. The captain's voice was clear, the system record undeniable. Dr. Alicia Grant belonged exactly where she sat. But in the age of instant connection, truth doesn't travel alone. It collides with the noise already set in motion. The businessman in 1C, the same one who had been smirking since boarding, was already uploading his clip. He had titled it, "Entitled Passenger Refuses to Leave First Class," and sent it racing into the bloodstream of social media. Within seconds, the video was live on X, gathering likes faster than the plane could ever fly. Viewers ate it up. Typical. Scam artist. She's gonna sue. The comments came in waves, fueled by bias, blind to evidence. In row 3, a college student hunched over her phone, fingers moving like sparks, pushing hashtags into trending territory. A first-class fraud, # seat stealer, # drama in the skies. But something unexpected happened. A sharp-eyed viewer paused the video, zooming in on the flash of black and silver on Alicia's tray table. "Wait," the caption read. "Is that Nova Aerospace?" Screenshots multiplied. Threads exploded. Aviation forums lit up with recognition. Someone posted a keynote photo of Alicia at a global aerospace summit. Another shared an article. Meet the woman changing the future of commercial aviation. The narrative began to bend, then break. In row 3B, Elena Cruz, an aerospace engineering student, refreshed her feed. Her jaw dropped as she saw her mentor's name, Dr. Alicia Grant, erupt across her screen. The woman she had studied in textbooks, admired from afar, was right here, enduring an insult that never should have happened. The businessman's clip was still spreading, but it was unraveling in real time. People weren't just watching, they were investigating, reframing, rewriting the story. The cabin was still tense, but outside, across phones, timelines, and comment threads, the storm had only just begun. The captain's validation had settled the seat dispute, but Alicia knew this wasn't just about one flight. The murmurs, the live streams, the dismissals, it all pointed to something deeper, something systemic. And sometimes the only way to correct a broken lens is to reveal the whole picture. She reached calmly into the inner pocket of her blazer, her movements unhurried, almost ceremonial. Passengers craned their necks expecting anger, maybe even confrontation. Instead, she placed a second business card gently on the tray table. This one was smaller, simpler. Matte, stock, clean typeface, no metallic emboss, no flourish, just the words that mattered. Alicia Grant, co-founder and COO, Hamilton Equity Partners. A hush swept the cabin, even deeper than before. Captain Hayes blinked, then leaned closer. His eyes widened as recognition set in. Hamilton Equity, he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. Alicia's gaze was steady, her voice measured. Yes, Captain. Through Hamilton, I helped lead the acquisition of a 12% stake in your parent company. So in a sense, she let the pause hang, the silence do the work. I'm not just a passenger. I'm also a part owner of this airline. Gasps. Phones trembled in hands suddenly less steady. In one C, the businessman's jaw slackened, his camera dropping slightly. Someone in the back whispered, "She owns the plane." Another muttered, "This just flipped completely." Online, the wildfire doubled in speed. Aviation Twitter picked it up. Finance bloggers screenshot Bloomberg profiles. Threads multiplied. This isn't seat theft, it's corporate oversight live. Kelly Morton, once smug, now paled as her livestream comments turned venomous against her. "That's your boss's boss," one viewer wrote. "Delete this before you're fired." But it was too late. The footage was everywhere. And now the truth wasn't just revealed. It was undeniable. For the first time, Alicia leaned back into her seat, her presence radiating not just dignity but leverage. The story had outgrown the cabin. It now belonged to the entire industry. The cabin was frozen in disbelief. The weight of Alicia's second card still hung in the air like gravity itself had shifted. Passengers stared, phones trembled, and even Officer Riley had taken a step back, suddenly unsure of his authority. For the first time, silence wasn't loaded with suspicion. It was loaded with realization. Dr. Alicia Grant let the moment breathe. Then, with the same calm precision she had carried since boarding, she spoke clearly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "I'm requesting 3 immediate actions," she said. Her tone wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was the tone of someone used to negotiating deals that stretched across continents, someone who understood leverage at its deepest level. First, she continued, termination of any employee who chose to livestream this incident without passenger consent. Second, suspension of all crew members directly involved pending full investigation. Third, a formal apology from corporate leadership, public, transparent, and addressing the assumptions that caused this event. Gasps fluttered through the rows. This wasn't a complaint. It was a blueprint. Captain Hayes stiffened, his jaw tight. Officer Riley glanced at Kelly Morton, whose phone was now dark in her trembling hand. She looked like a child caught with stolen candy, only the candy had already been broadcast to thousands of strangers online. Alicia's gaze sharpened. And until those conditions are met, negotiations between Nova Aerospace Systems and your airline for 20 new aircraft will remain paused. 14 of your current planes are leased through US MA. That partnership will not expand until this matter is resolved with transparency. The ripple that moved through the cabin wasn't just surprise, it was recognition. Everyone understood what she had just done. This was no longer about one insult, one flight attendant, or one misunderstanding. Alicia had just transformed humiliation into systemic accountability. The businessman in 1C lowered his camera entirely. His smirk was gone. For once, he had nothing to record. Because the truth was speaking louder than drama ever could. For a long suspended moment, no one moved. The demands Alicia Grant had laid out still echoed in the cabin, each word carving into the silence. She had shifted the frame so completely that the very people who had whispered, judged, and recorded now sat in the uneasy glow of self-recognition. It started with the man in seat 1C, the businessman who had posted gleefully only minutes before. His phone rested heavy in his hand, screen still glowing with notifications as his video spread. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he rose to his feet. His voice, when it came, was softer than the arrogance he had shown earlier. "I need to apologize," he said, facing Alicia. The cabin's collective gaze turned on him. "I assumed, I judged, I didn't ask questions, I just, recorded." He lifted his phone slightly, a gesture of confession. "My video's already out there. People are sharing it. But I'll post the truth too. The full truth." Alicia didn't speak. She didn't reward him with forgiveness. She simply nodded once, steady and deliberate, leaving the weight of accountability in his hands. In row 3A, a young woman who had kept her eyes glued to her Kindle finally found her voice. Her words trembled, but they carried the ring of honesty. "I saw it happen. I heard what she said to you, and I said nothing. I kept my head down because I didn't want to get involved. That was cowardice." Across the aisle, Marcus Hill, the retired firefighter, gave her a small nod of respect. "Owning it matters," he said quietly. "Most folks never do." The reflection spread like a chain reaction. It wasn't loud, but it was palpable. People shifting in their seats, glancing down at their hands, realizing they hadn't just been witnesses. They had been participants, even in silence. And that, Alicia knew, was the deeper battle. Not just one against blatant insult, but against the quiet complicity that gives insult its power. The cabin's atmosphere had shifted. What began as entertainment for some and humiliation for others had transformed into a mirror, one that no passenger could fully avoid. Eyes darted, breath slowed, and the silence between words grew heavy with truth. From seat 2D, an elderly woman who had earlier whispered to her husband now leaned forward. Her hands trembled slightly as she clasped them together in her lap. For a long moment, she said nothing. The hush was so complete that the faint hum of the aircraft's engines seemed louder. Finally, her voice cracked through the stillness. "I was part of the problem," she admitted, her tone fragile but deliberate. Her husband looked at her in surprise, but she kept her gaze fixed on Alicia. "I let it happen. I nodded when I shouldn't have. I told myself it was harmless, just words, but it isn't." Her voice wavered, breaking like thin glass. "It's not harmless. It's not normal. And I shouldn't have stayed quiet." The confession lingered in the air, heavier than any accusation. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably, some staring at their shoes, others at Alicia, waiting for her response. Alicia didn't raise her voice. She didn't deliver anger. Her reply was steady, her words landing with the clarity of carved stone. "Change doesn't begin when someone gets caught," she said, her tone firm yet almost gentle. "It begins when someone chooses to see what they ignored. Silence is not neutrality. It's permission." The elderly woman closed her eyes, tears welling, and gave a small nod. Around her, the lesson rippled outward. It was no longer about a single insult or even a single crew member. It was about the patterns too many had accepted as ordinary. And in that cabin, high above the ground, those patterns had been called out, named, and broken. The weight of confession hung in the air like smoke, thick and undeniable. A dozen silent passengers had become reluctant witnesses to their own complicity, and yet Alicia Grant did not linger on shame. She understood something deeper. Destruction without construction is only half a story. She reached into her slim leather folio, sliding out a sleek tablet. The glow lit her face as the screen came alive with organized files and clear frameworks. Passengers leaned forward instinctively, curious, uneasy, compelled. This wasn't the gesture of a victim clinging to vindication, it was the gesture of a leader pivoting to vision. Alicia tapped a folder labeled Airfare Initiative. She turned the screen slightly, letting the nearest rows glimpse its contents. A set of bullet points glowed in calm blue, mandatory unconscious bias training for all customer-facing employees. Formalized passenger verification protocols, documentation before assumption. 24-hour passenger advocacy hotline monitored by a neutral oversight board. Quarterly diversity and accountability reports submitted to the FAA and made public. Her voice was measured, architectural, each word laid like a brick in the foundation of a new structure. "I'm not interested in a personal settlement," she said, her eyes sweeping the cabin. "I'm interested in systemic change. This industry doesn't just transport passengers, it reflects society. And if it reflects bias, then it fails at its most basic duty, dignity." Captain Hayes blinked, caught between awe and obligation. Officer Riley glanced away, suddenly small in a uniform that no longer granted him the higher ground. Even Kelly Morton, pale and silent now, seemed to understand that this was no longer about her. It was about a culture that had allowed her confidence to curdle into cruelty. Alicia's gaze never faltered. Real leadership doesn't end at pointing out what's broken. It stays long enough to build something better. In that moment, 30,000 feet above the ground, the cabin wasn't just a cabin. It had become a boardroom, a classroom, a blueprint for transformation. The glow from Alicia Grant's tablet wasn't just light, it was revelation. Passengers who moments ago had been skeptics now leaned closer, not to scrutinize, but to absorb. The neat columns of her airfare initiative weren't slogans or empty promises. They were policies, drafted and ready, each bullet point sharp enough to pierce the complacency that had filled these skies for years. In seat 3B, Elena Cruz's hands trembled as she raised her phone again. Not to capture humiliation, but to livestream reform. Her caption was short but electric. "When quiet power speaks, the industry listens." Viewers poured in. Aviation students, activists, journalists. Within minutes, hundreds were tuned in, sharing the feed across platforms with hashtags that shifted from mockery to movement. Fly with respect, Wirefare Initiative was Alicia Grant. The businessman in 1C, still red-faced from his earlier confession, whispered to his neighbor, This is bigger than us." The neighbor nodded, phone forgotten in his lap, as if the gravity of the moment had pinned it there. Even Captain Hayes stood straighter, as though reminded of the duty behind his uniform. He glanced at the tablet, then at Alicia, the recognition dawning. He wasn't simply witnessing a complaint, he was standing at the threshold of an industry shift. Outside the cabin, the wildfire of social media was mutating. News alerts pinged, blogs and forums lit up with headlines. Airline discrimination turns into policy demands, and Alicia Grant outlines reform at 30,000 feet. Inside, Alicia remained composed, hands folded neatly in her lap. She hadn't raised her voice once. She hadn't needed to. With preparation and proof, she had transformed a moment of prejudice into a masterclass in leadership. And for the first time, passengers weren't just watching a scandal. They were witnessing reform. Live, unedited, undeniable. The cabin vibrated softly as the engines hummed awake, a reminder that despite the storm within, the aircraft still had a journey ahead. Ground crew signals flashed outside the windows, the tug latched to the nose gear, and slowly the plane began to roll back from the gate. It was as if the entire flight, passengers, crew, captain, had been held in suspension, waiting for a verdict, and only now were they allowed to move. Dr. Alicia Grant sat composed in 2A, her tablet closed, her expression unreadable but resolute. Around her, passengers who had once whispered accusations now shifted in their seats with a different kind of restlessness, reflection. Some avoided her gaze, others studied her with new respect, a few still fumbling with the weight of their own silence. Captain Hayes returned to the cockpit, but not before pausing at Alicia's seat. He gave a small, respectful nod, not as a formality, but as acknowledgement. It was subtle, almost private, yet the entire cabin saw it. Kelly Morton remained by the galley, her phone tucked away, shoulders tight as if bracing for impact of another kind. The live stream she had once celebrated as content now replayed endlessly on screens far beyond this plane, transformed into evidence of bias and arrogance. Online, the story was no longer passenger disrupts flight. It was CEO forces airline reckoning mid-air. Clips of Alicia's calm, her cards on the tray, her initiative on the tablet, had begun circulating with captions like, "This is what leadership looks like." As the aircraft pushed back, passengers collectively exhaled. The physical motion mirrored the emotional shift. The flight was leaving the gate, but it was also leaving behind the illusion that silence could shield injustice. Alicia leaned back against her headrest, not as a victor basking in triumph, but as a leader who understood the work wasn't finished. The true journey, the one that would ripple through an entire industry, was only just beginning. The plane's engines thrummed steadily. a low chorus beneath the silence that still clung to the cabin. But this silence was different from before. It was no longer heavy with suspicion, it was layered with reflection, uncomfortable yet necessary. Passengers were not just traveling, they were carrying questions they hadn't prepared to confront. Dr. Alicia Grant adjusted the cuff of her blazer and folded her hands neatly in her lap. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't begged for recognition. She hadn't thrown her titles like weapons. She had simply sat, unshaken, prepared. And in doing so, she had shifted the gravity of an entire flight. That was the essence of quiet power. It doesn't roar. It doesn't scramble for validation. It waits, precise and deliberate, until the truth has no choice but to surface. It uses presence as protest, patience as proof. Across the rows, eyes lingered on her, not with judgment now, but with something else. Respect, perhaps even reverence. The businessman in 1C stared at the floor, his earlier smirk long dissolved. The young woman in 3A hugged her Kindle tighter, her earlier silence now heavy in her hands. And Elena Cruz, still holding her phone, whispered softly to her live audience. She didn't have to shout, she just had to be ready. The hum of the engines grew louder as the plane taxied, but the lesson was louder still. Power doesn't always announce itself with noise or force. Sometimes it takes the form of a black woman in C2A, calm and immovable, reminding an entire cabin and now the world that dignity is not up for debate. And in that realization, everyone aboard understood. They had not witnessed a disruption. They had witnessed a masterclass. The aircraft rumbled forward, gathering speed along the runway, yet inside the cabin, the pace of thought was slower, heavier. Every passenger carried their own reckoning now. The moment was no longer just about a boarding pass or a seat. It had become a mirror, forcing each person to ask themselves uncomfortable questions. Dr. Alicia Grant sat back, her eyes steady on the window, but her presence filled the cabin. She hadn't delivered a speech or demanded attention, and still she had drawn every gaze, commanded every breath. Quiet power had rewritten the narrative, and now it asked something more. Her voice came at last, low and calm, but with enough weight to carry through the rows. "Have you ever been underestimated?" she asked, not to one passenger in particular, but to all of them. "Have you ever seen someone dismissed, spoken over, or pushed aside because they didn't fit a stereotype?" The words rippled outward. Passengers shifted uncomfortably, some nodding faintly, others frozen in thought. Alicia let the silence linger before continuing. "What did you do in that moment? Did you look away? Did you let silence speak for you? Or did you stand where dignity needed you to stand?" The engines roared as the plane lifted into the sky, but Alicia's words stayed grounded, lodged in the minds of everyone listening. She leaned back into her seat, her tone softening, almost reflective. "Next time, the question isn't whether it will happen. The question is, what will you do?" No one replied. They didn't need to. The challenge had been set, not just for the passengers in that cabin, but for everyone who would watch, share, and replay this story across the world. Because Alicia hadn't come to raise her voice. She had come to raise the standard, and now it was on others to decide whether they would rise to meet it. The jet climbed higher, banking gently as city lights dwindled beneath the wings. Inside, the cabin no longer buzzed with judgment or gossip. Instead, it carried something rare on a crowded flight: introspection. Passengers stared at their hands, their screens, the curve of the seat ahead, but their minds were elsewhere, replaying every word, every silence, every choice they had just witnessed. Dr. Alicia Grant sat quietly in 2A, her tablet now tucked away, her presence no longer defiant but steady, almost serene. She wasn't basking in victory. She wasn't collecting apologies. She was doing what leaders do, thinking ahead, already considering the ripples her actions would send across boardrooms, training rooms, and entire industries. On the ground, the story was no longer contained within this cabin. News outlets had already begun running headlines. Airline faces reckoning mid-flight, and Alicia Grant calls for systemic reform at 30,000 feet. While hashtags pulsed across platforms. Quiet power has fly with respect. Alicia Grant. What had started as an insult was now a movement, one that no corporate spin team could reel back. But Alicia's closing words lingered the loudest. "Next time, what will you do?" They weren't meant just for those seated around her. They were meant for anyone watching, reading, or listening to the retelling of this moment. The plane leveled into cruising altitude. Passengers exhaled, but the weight of the lesson remained. Quiet power had proven itself unstoppable. It didn't just defend a seat, it defended the principle that dignity is not optional. And now the story belonged to the world. Have you ever been underestimated? Have you ever stayed silent when silence hurt someone else? What will you do the next time dignity is tested? If this story moved you, challenged you, or forced you to see power differently, share it. Let it ripple. Subscribe for more truths like this one. Because here, we don't raise our voices to be heard, we raise the standard and let the world catch up. The descent began with the familiar chime of the seatbelt sign, but for the passengers of this flight, nothing felt routine. The engines droned as the aircraft tilted downward, yet inside the cabin, every glance toward Dr. Alicia Grant carried the weight of recognition. She had not shouted, she had not demanded, and still she had rewritten the script for everyone aboard. As the wheels kissed the runway with a soft thud, the world outside was already erupting. News vans idled at the airport. Journalists, tipped off by trending hashtags, were drafting stories before the plane even reached the gate. Clips of Alicia's black card, her CEO title, and her calm dismantling of bias had been mirrored, reposted, dissected. A reckoning at 30,000 feet was the headline climbing fastest. Within corporate headquarters, the alarms were louder. Executives scrolled through alerts, legal flagged exposure, PR flagged reputational risk, investor relations flagged volatility. Stock analysts were already questioning whether this airline could survive a public relations freefall, and threaded through every internal memo was the same name, Alicia Grant. On board, passengers knew they were stepping off into more than just an airport terminal. Some sat quietly rehearsing their apologies. Others prepared to share their own perspective online, some to confess complicity, others to claim they had witnessed history. But Alicia remained still, her gaze steady, her hands folded in her lap as the plane taxied to the gate. She wasn't chasing headlines, she wasn't chasing revenge, she was waiting. Because true change doesn't happen in the noise of arrival. It happens in the quiet after, when systems scramble to catch up. This wasn't just a landing, it was the beginning of turbulence for an entire industry. By the time the aircraft rolled to the gate, the world beyond its cabin had already transformed the incident into a headline, a hashtag, a case study. Newsrooms scrambled to edit footage pulled from social media streams. On cable channels, anchors leaned forward with urgency. Tonight, a major U.S. airline faces accusations of bias after a first-class passenger, later identified as aerospace CEO Dr. Alicia Grant, was asked to leave her rightful seat. On Twitter, the narrative spun at light speed. One thread broke down the sequence frame by frame. Kelly Morton's smirk, Officer Riley's demand, the flash of Alicia's Centurion card, the reveal of her equity stake. This isn't just discrimination, one viral post read. It's a masterclass in dismantling it. Hashtags like #QuietPower, #FlyWithRespect, and #Airfare initiative surged into trending columns across the US. In aviation forums, professionals debated what it meant for the industry. If she pauses those contracts, one insider wrote, this airline is grounded before it takes off. Corporate lawyers shared articles on passenger rights. Diversity officers posted think pieces about unconscious bias. Investors whispered about shareholder meetings that might come sooner than expected. Meanwhile, classrooms buzzed. Elena Cruz's live stream had already been replayed in university chat groups. We just saw policy made mid-air, one student typed. Professors began circulating the clip as a case study, leadership under pressure, systemic bias, and corporate accountability, all unfolding in real time. And through it all, Alicia's image repeated, seated calmly in 2A, cards on the tray, her posture steady. She hadn't given interviews, she hadn't spoken to the press, but silence, once weaponized against her, was now her most powerful statement. She didn't chase the narrative, she owned it. And now the world was the one trying to keep pace. The conference room at Atlantic Airlines' US headquarters was never meant to feel claustrophobic. It had high ceilings, glass walls, and a polished mahogany table that stretched the length of the room. Yet on this night, as executives huddled around glowing screens and vibrating phones, the space felt suffocating. The trending hashtags scrolled across a wall-mounted monitor. Quiet Power, Fly with Respect, Airfare Initiative. Clips of Dr. Alicia Grant sitting calmly in 2A were replaying on every news channel, framed not as a scandal but as a turning point. The chief operating officer slammed a folder shut. This isn't just bad press. She controls leverage. Nova Aerospace supplies 14 of our aircraft. Hamilton Equity holds 12% of our parent company. We cannot afford a public war with her. The general counsel added grimly, "It's already a legal liability. Live streaming a passenger without consent? That's invasion of privacy, clear as day. If she pushes this into litigation, we'll bleed millions before we even see a courtroom." The head of PR looked pale, scrolling through mentions on her tablet. Every outlet is running with her initiative, not her demands, not her anger, her policy blueprint. They're calling it the airfare reform package. If we resist it, we look like we're protecting bias. If we adopt it, we admit fault. Silence fell. Executives shifted in leather chairs, the weight of their complicity pressing against them. Finally, the CEO leaned forward, voice low but firm. "We have no choice. Draft the apology. Call Hayes. Suspend Morton immediately, and prepare a public commitment to explore the airfare initiative." Nobody argued. The truth was undeniable. The airline wasn't steering this crisis anymore. Alicia Grant was. By morning, the story had leapt beyond one airline's boardroom. It was no longer just a corporate crisis. It was a cultural flashpoint. On Capitol Hill, lawmakers stepped in front of cameras, some citing the viral clips as evidence of why transportation needed stronger oversight. "No passenger should be treated differently because of the color of their skin," one senator declared. "What Dr. Grant experienced isn't just a personal insult, it's a systemic failure." Committees whispered about hearings, about mandating transparency not only in hiring but in passenger treatment across the industry. Civil rights groups issued statements within hours. The NAACP called it an instructive case study in modern discrimination. The ACLU highlighted the unlawful nature of live streaming passengers without consent. Even unions began weighing in, some defending crew members, others acknowledging that unchecked bias had poisoned customer trust. On social media, ordinary travelers added their own stories. Under the hashtag #NATA, Fly with Respect, thousands of posts poured in. Passengers recalling moments of being doubted, dismissed, or disrespected. Some shared grainy boarding pass photos. Others recounted how they'd been asked to prove they belonged in spaces they had paid for. Universities picked it up. Leadership professors pointed to Alicia's calm, deliberate handling as a case study in dignified disruption. Business schools dissected her use of leverage, how she transformed an insult into a policy negotiation in real time. Meanwhile, investors circled. Atlantic Airlines stock ticked downward as analysts speculated whether adoption of the airfare initiative was inevitable. "It's not just optics," one wrote. "It's about survival." Through it all, the image of Alicia Grant remained consistent, seated calmly in 2A, hands folded, not raising her voice, yet shaking an entire industry. The ripple was no longer a ripple. It was a wave, and it was still gaining momentum. The seatbelt sign blinked off, and the familiar shuffle of passengers rising filled the cabin. Overhead bins clicked open, bags thumped down, and yet the usual chaos of disembarkation felt muted. People weren't just leaving a flight, they were leaving a story they knew would follow them long after they stepped into the terminal. At the front, Dr. Alicia Grant stood. Her blazer was still immaculate, her suitcase rolling silently behind her. She didn't rush, didn't glance around for approval, didn't need to. Passengers stepped aside as she moved down the aisle, not out of fear, but out of a quiet recognition. The same mouths that had whispered accusations hours earlier now stayed closed, their silence weighted with respect. Captain Hayes waited near the exit door. As Alicia passed, he inclined his head. A small gesture, but one carrying the weight of acknowledgement from a man who had flown long enough to know the skies rarely offered justice. She returned the nod, neither warm nor cold, just measured. Kelly Morton lingered by the galley, eyes lowered, her badge suddenly heavy against her uniform. She opened her mouth, perhaps to apologize, perhaps to explain, but no words came. Alicia didn't pause. She didn't need her apology. The system would handle what her silence could not. As Alicia stepped onto the jet bridge, cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, passengers lifted their phones, the world leaned in. But she didn't stop. She didn't grandstand. She simply walked forward, steady and composed, carrying with her the image that had already traveled farther than this plane ever would. A black woman in seat 2A, calm, immovable, and unshakably prepared. Some leaders speak loudly to be heard. Alicia Grant had raised no voice, and yet she had raised the standard. And now it was the world's turn to catch up. The doors hissed open, releasing a draft of cool airport air into the cabin. Passengers gathered their belongings, but the usual impatience to escape was absent. Instead, there was a hush, an unspoken awareness that they were stepping out of more than just an airplane. They had been present for something that would live far beyond this flight. Dr. Alicia Grant rose from seat 2A with the same quiet dignity she had carried from the beginning. She adjusted her blazer, retrieved her suitcase, and moved toward the aisle. Each step was deliberate, measured. Passengers shifted aside without being asked, a small corridor forming naturally around her. The same eyes that had once judged now followed with a kind of reverence, as though they were watching not just a traveler, but a chapter of history walk past them. At the door, Captain Hayes waited. His nod was deeper this time, almost ceremonial. It wasn't the gesture of an airline employee to a passenger, it was a salute from one professional to another, from someone who had witnessed a standard being reset. Alicia returned the nod with a calm grace, then stepped forward. The flash of cameras hit immediately. Reporters leaned in, voices overlapping. "Dr. Grant, will you sue?" "Dr. Grant, do you believe this airline can change?" She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The story had already been told, not in her voice, but in her silence, her preparation, her presence. As she disappeared down the jet bridge, the final image lingered. A black woman CEO, composed, unyielding, carrying both the scars of bias and the blueprint for reform. She hadn't just claimed the seat, she had claimed the principle. And now, the burden and the opportunity belonged to everyone who had witnessed it. The cabin doors swung open, and cool airport air rushed inside, mingling with the stale weight of everything that had happened. Passengers shuffled for their bags, but there was no chatter, no impatient sighs. They moved quietly, each one still carrying the mirror Alicia Grant had held up to them in midair. In 2A, Alicia stood. She adjusted her blazer, collected her suitcase, and began her walk down the aisle. Passengers parted instinctively, creating space, their eyes lowered or lingering with reverence. The same people who once whispered doubts now yielded, not out of fear, but out of recognition. At the doorway, Captain Hayes waited. His nod was deeper this time, carrying the weight of both apology and respect. Alicia returned the gesture, measured and calm, before stepping onto the jet bridge. Cameras flashed immediately. Reporters shouted questions. "Dr. Grant, will you sue?" "Dr. Grant, what comes next?" But she didn't stop. She didn't need to. The story was already told, not by her voice, but by her presence, her preparation, her refusal to bend. And now the story belongs to you. Have you ever been underestimated? Have you watched someone dismissed, spoken over, or pushed aside simply because they didn't fit the picture others expected? What did you do? And more importantly, what will you do the next time silence asks for your permission? If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you see power through a different lens, share it, let it ripple, subscribe for more. Because here, we don't just tell stories, we tell black stories, real ones. And just like Alicia Grant, we don't raise our voices to be heard, we raise the standard and let the world catch up.